Oxford University, with its 800-year legacy, had never known such profound silence. The Sheldonian Theatre was packed that March afternoon, its walls steeped in centuries of tradition. Among the distinguished crowd of 500 academics sat Professor Edmund Harrington, a man revered for his decades of scholarship on European history and civilization. As the audience settled, Harrington took to the stage, a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He exuded authority earned through years of published works and lectures. He began confidently, his voice echoing off the ancient stone. "When we examine the pillars of human advancement," Harrington proclaimed, "we see clear patterns. Mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain. These are the foundations of what we call civilization, distinctly Western in origin." A few uneasy shifts echoed through the audience, but Harrington's tone remained steady, bordering on dismissive. Then, 20 minutes into his lecture, he uttered the words that would define his legacy and end his career. "Some might ask about other continents' contributions," he said, pausing for effect. "Asia gave us gunpowder and paper. The Americas offered sophisticated calendars. But Africa? I challenge anyone here to name a single significant contribution from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor." The silence that followed was deafening. In the front row, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat motionless for a moment. Slowly, he closed his notebook and placed his pen down with deliberate calm. Around him, several African students and scholars sat frozen, caught between outrage and the intimidating weight of challenging a senior Oxford professor in such a hallowed space. Minutes stretched like hours until Traoré raised his hand. "Yes?" Harrington responded, irritation flickering across his face. He clearly had not expected to be questioned. Traoré stood, his movements measured, his voice steady though unamplified. "Professor Harrington, I would like to respond to your assertion." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many pulled out phones, quietly recording the moment as anticipation built. Harrington's smirk deepened. "By all means, Mr. Traoré, enlighten us, but please stick to historical facts rather than romantic nationalism." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Traoré stepped forward to the podium, placing a simple leather folder on the lectern. For a moment, he surveyed the audience, then fixed his gaze on Harrington. "Professor," he began, "before I address your challenge, may I ask, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu, studied the mathematical treatises of the Dune people, examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya of Tanzania?" Harrington waved a dismissive hand. "Ancient mud buildings and folklore hardly constitute civilization. We are discussing contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Yet Traoré remained composed. Opening his folder, he pulled out a photocopy of an ancient text. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said, holding it aloft. "This is a page from the Libombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It is 44,000 years old and contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. 29 distinct notches, marking lunar cycles. Mathematics did not begin in Greece. It began here in Africa." Harrington's smirk faded, but he quickly regained composure. "Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras," he scoffed. Traoré pulled out another document. "Then consider the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, which contains evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. This predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years." A hush settled. The weight of the facts was undeniable. "Would you prefer more recent examples?" Traoré asked. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 12th century. Centuries before Oxford existed as anything more than a collection of drinking halls. The audience leaned forward, rapt. Traoré's voice grew stronger, but never raised. You mentioned law coming from Rome. Shall we discuss the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which included checks and balances centuries before the American Constitution, or the Buganda Parliament, with its democratic system, while Europe was ruled by monarchs? You speak of philosophy from Germany, Traoré continued, now fully in his element. Have you read the works of Zera Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher who wrote on rational inquiry and human rights, predating the European Enlightenment? His student Walter Hayward produced treatises on ethics rivaling anything Europe had at the time. Harrington attempted to interject. These are isolated examples. Traoré raised a hand, silencing him. Isolated, Professor. Let me explain. Isolation. When the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's knowledge, your ancestors lived in mud huts. While African mathematicians calculated Earth's circumference, Europeans believed it flat. He paused, then raised his voice slightly. You want contributions to civilization. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century. The first Sigurian section, where both mother and child survived, took place in Uganda in 1879, using techniques centuries ahead of European medicine. Smallpox vaccination, long attributed to Jenner's cowpox discovery, was practiced through variolation in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans. Traoré pulled out an architectural diagram. Great Zimbabwe's acoustics surpass modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids predate Egyptian ones. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from volcanic rock, defy explanation even today. Perhaps you've never heard of these, Traoré said softly, because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats. Some professors nodded. Others looked stunned. Harrington's face was a mask of rising panic. But I am not finished, Professor, Traoré said. Metallurgy, the higher people of Tanzania, produced carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique unseen in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The Benin bronzes are so sophisticated that early Europeans refused to believe Africans made them, inventing stories of lost Portuguese craftsmen. Agriculture, Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon and okra. Complex irrigation systems in the Sahel sustained massive cities when European farming failed. The terraced farms of the Dune people have thrived for a millennium in harsh conditions. Traoré looked directly at Harrington, now visibly sweating. And most importantly, he said, let's discuss Ubuntu, the philosophy of I am because we are. While European thought focused on individual conquest, African philosophy emphasized restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity, ideas only now gaining acceptance worldwide. His voice softened but cut deep. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, is not that Africa contributed nothing. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent decades erasing and denigrating those contributions. He pulled out one final paper, a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that may have funded Harrington's education. In it, Rhodes explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance is no accident. It is the product of a deliberate, systematic effort, and you have perpetuated it for 47 years. The theater was utterly silent. Harrington stood at the side, mouth opening and closing, but no words came. Traoré was not yet finished. I could speak for hours, he said, of the Dune astronomers who tracked Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes, of fractal geometry in African art predating Mandelbrot by centuries, of African call and response music that laid the foundations for jazz, blues, and rock. But I think I have made my point. He fixed Harrington with a steady gaze. The question is not whether Africa contributed. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, have ignored or denied this truth. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row. Then another. Within moments, the entire theater erupted in applause. Students, professors, even administrators rose to their feet. The most remarkable moment came from Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, who stood and spoke into the microphone. "Mr. President," she said, acknowledging Traoré's title for the first time, "as a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately revise its history programs to include these African contributions." The applause grew even louder. Harrington, isolated on the side of the stage, searched desperately for support, but found none. When the applause finally subsided, Traoré spoke once more. "I do not seek apologies," he said quietly. "I seek truth. Human civilization is not the property of one continent or race. It is the sum of all human achievement, from the earliest African mathematics to today's scientific breakthroughs. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice." He gathered his papers and walked back to his seat. Passing Harrington, he paused. "Professor," he said clearly, "loud enough for microphones, I have left copies of these sources with your department. I hope you will read them." The aftermath was swift. Virtues of Traoré's response flooded social media, quickly going viral with titles like "African President Destroys Racist Oxford Professor, Epic Academic Takedown." By morning, millions had watched. News outlets around the world covered the story. African scholars shared further evidence supporting Traoré's claims. The hashtag #Africa built civilization trended globally. The next day, Harrington announced early retirement. Oxford issued a formal apology and committed to a full review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre, site of the confrontation, would host a new annual lecture series on African contributions. The first speaker, Ibrahim Traoré. Most importantly, African studies enrollment surged worldwide. Young historians began exploring African archives, long ignored. 1 year later, Oxford unveiled a new statue in its main quadrangle, not of Traoré, who declined the honor, but of Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the 16th century scholar whose 1,600 books on law, medicine, and mathematics educated generations, while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, truth belongs to all humanity." Years later, Traoré reflected on that day. "I did not intend to give that speech," he admitted, "but when Professor Harrington spoke, I thought of African children who would hear those lies, of brilliant minds erased from history. The real tragedy," he said, "is not his ignorance. It's that such views were accepted at an institution dedicated to truth. How many students absorbed these falsehoods for 47 years? How many went on to wield power with prejudice? That is why I spoke, not to humiliate, but to break the cycle." When asked if his response was too harsh, Traoré shook his head. "For centuries, African history was written by those who enslaved and colonized us. They sought to erase our achievements. When you have been denied your history so long, speaking truth is not harsh, it is necessary." Today, the Traoré moment is studied worldwide as a turning point in academic discourse. It stands as a powerful reminder. Knowledge requires humility, curiosity, and courage to challenge long-held beliefs. It proved that sometimes the strongest weapon against prejudice is not anger or violence, but truth delivered with dignity and backed by facts. In classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, teachers now begin lessons on African history with this simple truth. Africa is not just part of human civilization. It is where human civilization began. The silence that fell over Oxford that March afternoon was not just the end of one professor's career. It was the beginning of a long overdue conversation about whose stories are told, whose achievements are remembered, and whose contributions shape humanity.